I'm an environmental compliance engineer. 22 years reading soil reports, groundwater tables, and the fine print buried in county zoning ordinances. Most people never bother opening. That background is the only reason I survived what happened on my ranch, because the woman who tried to take it from me wasn't fighting with malice alone. She was fighting with paperwork, and paperwork happens to be my language. The ranch had belonged to my family since 1961. 2,000 acres of dry grass, cottonwood creek beds, and a fence line my grandfather walked with a shovel and a bad hip. I inherited it 4 years ago when my mother passed, and for a while I didn't do much with it beyond leasing the grazing rights and paying the taxes. I wasn't watching it closely enough, and that's on me. That's the first thing I want to be honest about, because this story isn't really about a villain. It's about what happens when you look away from something you love for too long. The first sign something was wrong came as a mailer. A glossy brochure addressed to future homeowner landed in my mailbox by mistake, advertising a luxury development called the Enclave of Silver Creek. Rolling hills, private trails, a clubhouse with a stone fireplace. The rendering looked expensive and tasteful, and it looked exactly like my back 40 acres, right down to the bend in the creek where my grandfather used to fish. I drove out there the next morning expecting nothing, maybe a surveying crew on the wrong side of a fence. What I found instead were framed houses, not stakes in the ground, not a permit sign. Framed, roofed in some cases. 44 structures in various stages of construction, a paved road cutting through what used to be my western pasture, and a woman in a quilted vest standing on the porch of a home, directing a crew like she owned the place. Her name, I'd soon learn, was Deborah Voss, president of the Silver Creek Homeowners Association Board, and self-appointed head of the development arm that had quietly formed under the Homeowners Association's nonprofit status 2 years earlier. When I told her this was my land, she didn't flinch. She smiled the way people smile when they've already rehearsed the conversation in their head 100 times and won every version of it. She told me the survey was clear, that the property line had always run along the creek, not the ridge, and that I was welcome to review the documentation at the HOA office if I had any concerns. That word concerns delivered with the practice calm of someone who has already priced you out of a fight. So, I did what I do for a living. I requested the original 1961 plat survey from the county recorder's office. It took 3 weeks to get an appointment, and when the clerk finally pulled the file, the document wasn't the survey. It was a photocopy of a photocopy, water damaged, missing the surveyor's seal, with a property line drawn in pen ink that didn't match the era of the original filing. I'd seen enough forged land records in my career to know what one looked like up close. This was one. That was the first twist I hadn't seen coming. The forged survey hadn't been slipped in by Deborah Voss. It had been filed 18 months earlier by my own cousin, Russell, who managed the county assessor's records division, and who I hadn't spoken to in years over an inheritance dispute about our grandfather's estate. Russell held a financial stake in the enclave through a shell LLC registered to his wife. He'd buried the fraud so deep in paperwork that even a careful person doing their own diligence would have missed it. Family, it turns out, can draw a property line just as dishonestly as any stranger can, and it stings twice as much when they do. I spent 4 months quietly building a case before telling anyone, because I knew the moment I went public, the story would stop being about facts and start being about narrative, and I was right. Deborah had already sold pre-construction contracts to 31 families, most of them young, most pouring their life savings into a down payment on a home that didn't legally exist yet. When word got out that I was disputing the property line, the town didn't see a fraud victim defending his grandfather's ranch. They saw a rich landowner trying to evict working families from their future homes. I received threats. Someone spray-painted greed across my barn door. A woman I'd known since grade school stopped making eye contact with me at the feed store. The night before the bulldozers came, I sat on my porch and watched the lights still burning inside half-built houses, where crews were rushing to finish drywall before an injunction could stop them. I remember thinking that the easiest thing in the world would be to simply let it go, sign something, take a settlement, let the enclave keep its name and its stone fireplace, and just carve out a smaller version of my inheritance to protect what remained. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid of losing, but because I was afraid of what winning was going to cost the families, who had nothing to do with any of this. The court battle took 11 months. My lawyer, a quiet man named Esteban who had spent most of his career on water rights disputes, built the case not around emotion, but around the construction financing itself. That was the second twist, the one that actually won it. Deborah hadn't funded the enclave through a conventional bank loan. She'd used a bridge loan secured against the disputed land itself, meaning the moment the court ruled the property was mine, the collateral underneath her entire financing structure legally belonged to me as well. She hadn't merely built on stolen land, she'd mortgaged stolen land to build even more of it. The judge's ruling wasn't dramatic in the way people tend to expect. There was no gavel-slamming speech. He read through the forged survey findings in a flat procedural voice, confirmed the original 1961 boundary, and then arrived at the part that actually broke Deborah. Because the 44 structures had been financed against land she never truly owned, The court ruled that ownership of the physical structures transferred to me as the rightful landholder, while her LLC remained solely and personally liable for the outstanding construction debt, the environmental remediation of the creek bed her crews had rerouted, and restitution owed to the 31 families who'd bought into a development that no longer belonged to her. She didn't get to simply walk away. She got to spend the next several years personally financing the undoing of her own legacy, wiring payments to people whose kitchen she'd once promised to build, while I decided what to do with 44 houses that were suddenly, legally, mine. I stood at the fence line the morning the demolition crews arrived, and I want to be honest, there was no triumph in it whatsoever. I didn't bulldoze all 44. I kept 9 of them, retrofitted, and eventually sold at cost to 9 of those 31 families who had lost their down payments. Because punishing Deborah was never going to undo what had happened to the people caught in the middle of it all. The other 35 came down over 3 weeks, and Deborah watched most of it from inside her car parked in the county road easement because that was the only land left that was still hers. She didn't scream when the ruling came down. She screamed 3 days later when the demolition crew hit the model home, the one with the stone fireplace from the brochure, the one she used to stand on the porch of like she already owned the entire valley. If you've made it this far, you already know this wasn't a simple story. And honestly, I think the messy parts, the cousin, the innocent families, the mortgage twist, are exactly the parts worth talking about. So, drop your thoughts in the comments about what you would have done differently. And if this kind of slow burn legal reckoning is your thing, stick around, because it's certainly not the last land war I've had to fight.